Classes in Wargame Design, a series of lectures based on George Philly's book, Designing Board Wargames, Introduction, to be available from Smashwords.com and Amazon Kindle. And today, Lecture 19, Command and Control Rules. So what we are going to do today is to advance roughly from where we cut off last time. That is, we are going to discuss rules, generalizations, and such not that are somewhat more sophisticated or different in some sense than are simply saying, well, we have all of these different ways we could do zones of control. Now, we do have all of these different ways we can do zones of control that are not the same as each other, but the point of saying that is just here are varieties, different things you could do, and variations, and I tossed in such issues as the zone of control that is 3 squares on one side of the unit, but not the other 3 squares. So the unit effectively covers a bit more terrain, but not a lot more terrain. Okay, so what can you do if you want to change a game? I shall go back to a scientific conference I was at many years ago in Canada. And it was noted that there were a set of handbooks that had recently been prepared on the elephant. And the French Academy gave us Love and the Elephant. The British Academy gave us The Elephant in the British Imperium. The German production, the visible part to date, was Handbook of Elephant Science, volumes 1 through 4, table of contents. The Americans, of course, gave us Bigger and Better Elephants, and from the Quebec Academy of Science, there was The Elephant, a Provincial, Not a Federal Issue. And there's an interpretation of this in terms of game design. The French gave us a game which focuses entirely on one sort of topic of play, which could be logistics or intelligence or something. The British gave us a historical version whose association with reality is somewhat enthusiastic, or at least you have to be enthusiastic to see it. The Germans gave us the extremely detailed rules on absolutely everything. The Americans gave us the monster game, and of course the Quebec reviewer was the reviewer who wanted to talk about how he thinks the game should have been designed and who completely ignores anything that was in the game or what the designer was thinking. A famous example of several famous examples of reviewers who did not pay attention to anything useful come to mind. There was a battle, Rorke's Drift, which was fought in southern Africa in the Victorian period. Someone did a battle of Rorke's Drift game and used one of the several variant spellings extant in period literature for Rourke. The referee reviewer waxed wroth for a page on the use of this alternative spelling, even though if you look through the literature, it's easy to find. There was also the reviewer, this was in the same journal, who was presented with one of the first large computer games in the sense it had lots of variables. This was a World War II on the Stalingrad type level, except you had finer control because the computer would keep track of more numerics. And the referee went on for page after page on German tactics and things that could be done for the computer. And if you weren't paying attention, you might not have noticed that the game could be played in which the player took either side and the AI took the other side. And the referee apparently hadn't noticed that the human player could take the Russians. At which point you wonder, well, what else didn't the reviewer notice that he got this actually rather fundamental issue wrong? So that's, geez, referee reviewer who talks maybe not about the issues you wanted to hear about. So, saying we want to produce a different game, One classic answer, which I have sort of mentioned before, is the tactics pi model. And the notion of the tactics pi model is we have a playing problem. And the playing problem is that we are the large local college or city gaming club. We would like to introduce people off the street to hex and counter board games. And there may be a fair number of people. And they may not all show up at the same time or have the same amount of time to play or whatever. How do we handle this? And the answer, which the MIT SGS invented close to a half century ago, was tactics pi. It's sort of like Tactics 2, the old Avalon Hill game. But the notion is we have a map board which is, 3 or 4 feet wide, because that's about the depth that people can have and be able to reach the middle. And it might be 10 or 15 feet long. The terrain is, of course, imaginary. It's a country or a pair of countries that do not exist. You put down very, very simple rules that are Stalingrad, but without some of the complications like weather or replacement cities. You just hand out replacements. And so the combat and movement rules are there, and the terrain is there, and almost nothing else is. And now you line up players roughly pairwise, and they have at each other. And at least some of the players you've planted actually know something about how to game and kibitz a bit. But the net result of all this is you get people into the game very quickly by making things very, very simple. The other end, of course, of bigger and better games, which I have talked about repeatedly, there are bunches of games where people have said, if it's going to be a monster game, if it's going to have a couple or 3, or in one Pacific Theater campaign game, 9,000 unit counters. If it's going to be enormous, it should have very complicated rules too. And the rules grow from the 4 pages of Stalingrad. I gave you sample copies of that so you'd see what they look like. If they grow to 10 pages or 30 pages or 70 pages, or for the introductory advanced squad leader rules, 140 pages in a ring binder so you can insert the supplements at the right location. And suddenly you have a game that is not only enormously big, but enormously complicated. So that's a different way to proceed with producing a bigger and better, or at least more complicated game. Having said, though, that you're going to make the game bigger, there are various different sorts of rules that you can talk about, and how you can make the rules more complicated, enrich player choice, implicitly maybe make the game bigger. One choice are certainly command and control rules. Now, the simplest command and control rules, this is found in Battles of Manassas, is to say, well, we have the individual units, and the individual units have divisional headquarters, and the divisional headquarters have corps headquarters, and then somewhere out here is the command for the entire army. And the simplest thing to say is that your units cannot get too spread out. And so the rule that is inserted is that from a corps headquarters to a division headquarters, there is a maximum number of movement points that can be required to go from one to the other. From the division headquarters to any of the actual units, there is a maximum number of unit points that can be required to go from one to the next. And if units find they are outside their command radius, they simply start marching by the most direct route towards their next highest headquarters until they get in range again. Of course, this can get inconvenient because suddenly the units that were supposed to be holding the line instead turn around and start marching home, and now you have holes in your line and various other unpleasant things. But it's a very simple command radius rule, which nonetheless shows the major issue in the largest single issue in command control, namely you can't send commands over large areas. The practical limit on radius of command is, well, you either send messengers out, or if it's very small units, you're limited to until quite recently, to human voice. The statement you're limited to human voice has several interesting consequences. Here, this is up to not quite Napoleonic period, are groups of men with muskets, and they are going to shoot at the enemy, and the question is, what arrangement do you make for the order in which they fire? And there were sort of two historical answers, one of which is that you fire by line, which is what you usually see in motion pictures. And the point of fire in line is, well, everyone in the front line shoots, and then there's some rearrangement, and now the people who'd been in the second line have walked forward, for example, and can shoot without blowing holes in the rest of their unit, and they shoot and you repeat. The severe problem with firing by line is that battlefields are noisy. And if you have an officer standing here trying to tell the next line when to fire, it's impossible to hear him. It's impossible to tell what's going on. And this leads to the scheme known as firing by platoon, in which you break up the unit into groups of men like that. The groups are 3 or 4 ranks deep. However, the front rank kneels, the second rank shoots over their head, the third rank is the very good people who are very careful to shoot between the heads of the people standing up in the second rank, or the people in the second rank fire and immediately sit down, and now the people in the third and fourth rank can shoot. And if you practice this, it's fairly rare for anyone to shoot the ear off the head of someone in front of them. And the command is fire by platoons, and therefore, for example, these 2 units fire, and then these 2 units fire, and then these 2 units fire. You don't have everyone fire all exactly the same time, because you always want to be in a position where there is a group of men who have loaded weapons. And if someone's horse cavalry shows up and charges your line, you wish to have these people ready to blow the horses away. You have to let the enemy close to point-blank range before this is possible, because period weapons couldn't hit very much. But horses are really big targets. So in any event, you have this general issue of command and control. And the simplest command and control you could do is sort of command radius. Now, command radius makes perfect sense if you have units on a battlefield, even as late as Civil War or a bit later, where you have messengers running back and forth. But you can do more complicated things in terms of command radius. And one of your choices, which is seen in the old victory games, the Civil War, is to say, here are the 2 players, and they're going to see what is going to happen. And so the issue is, you're trying to simulate the whole Civil War. An entire battle lasts only 2 or 4 days. If you say a battle lasts only 1 turn, which is about as small as things can get, you would need, if you just broke things into 3-day periods, 100 turns a year to march through, and in most of those 100 turns, absolutely nothing perceptible would happen. There would be lots going on in terms of trading men, moving supplies around, moving recruits around, but if you sort of looked at the map from a distance, you couldn't easily tell what was being done. And so what is done is to say, well, we have a certain number of command points. And the command points let us do various things that we might logically want to do. Move large groups of men, bring reinforcements on, There are various sorts of things you could imagine doing. And the notion here is, okay, we are going to expend command points, but we get to choose how we do it. So what is done is to say, we will take, and there's another issue. If you say one side moves first and the other moves second, the side that moves first appears to have initiative. However, in a battlefield as large as North America, which was huge by European standards, you might have local initiative, you might have initiative in this pair of states facing each other, but the fact that Grant had initiative in Virginia did not necessarily that Sherman had initiative in northern Georgia. And so what you do is to say, we will split the whole battlefield into theaters. And we will take turns, and we will have command points that are only available in a theater, and we will have some that are available overall. And players decide where their major, second, and third efforts are going to be focused in advance. And now we're going to do something else. We are going to roll dice. And the roll of the die is going to determine what we can do in each of a series of what are called impulses. Now, I am skipping large amounts of detail because it's a very elaborate set of rules, but the notion is I roll dice for some theater and you roll dice, and if I have a higher die roll than you are, the difference is the number of points I have to expend during the impulse to do things like bringing on reinforcements, using command points to move units, and so forth. You're going to be able to use just as many points as I am, but because I won the roll for that area, I get to do it first. And we keep doing this, and eventually, and there are a set of rules for what you have to do in terms of bringing on reinforcements, expending command points. Eventually, we have all used all of our command points and brought on all of our reinforcements, but we've done it lumpwise here and there. So it is a somewhat irregular and complicated rather than a very simple, I have the initiative, I get to do everything first. Instead, it's I have the initiative here, I get to do a bit, you'll get to do the same bit, and then we can proceed to see what happens next. Am I sort of getting things across? Now, the next layer up from command points, I should mention a variation on this. It's a sort of a simple variation. The game is called the Battle of Freeman's Farm. And the battle is, in essence, a piece of the Battle of Saratoga, so-called. And the notion here is, it's card-driven. And so I have a certain number of cards that give me a certain number of command points and a certain number of, I think they're called battle points. And the other fellow has a certain number of cards, but you draw at random. And so I place one card at random, and it tells me how many movement points I have to use. I'm being a little simplified. And what I can do in terms of combat, and it reflects the fact that neither side's units were exactly the greatest. The American unit were militia, and you could sort of point them in the right direction and poke them, but what they would actually do and to what extent they would respond to your leadership was a bit unpredictable. The British had their own, for all they were a professional army, had their own sets of problems. We eventually get to the British cavalry that was sent to the Battle of Bennington without horses. So they were wearing very uncomfortable cavalry boots. They were armed with sabers, which are very long swords. You need a long sword if you're on a horse. If I am sitting on a horse and the enemy soldier is directly under me, I need a sword that is long enough that if I stab straight down, I can reach his head. Because if I can't attack him. And there are historic examples, because there were armies that fought with fairly short swords, where the cavalryman is standing there, and the soldier on the other side has decided to lie down on the job. The soldier, of course, recognizes that horses are very finicky about where they will put their feet, and they will not step on someone if they have reasonable control of their own position, if there's reasonable choice. Now, if they're in a charge and there is a mess and they suddenly find bodies on the ground, well, they'll do the best they can, because when a horse stumbles, it typically breaks a leg, which is fatal. And they're tall and they're heavy, and the rolling damage can be quite significant, not to mention they can roll on top of their own cavalrymen. In any event, Freeman's Farm, you don't quite know what you can get your army to do, so you can make plans, but you better realize those plans are uncertain. Freeman's Farm is a descendant. I mentioned the very complicated, the Civil War rules, very well worth serious study. The bottom end, the very first modern board war game, Tactics, had a command and control rule. And the command and control rule was that there was something called the basic turn allowance. Now, in the second edition, each unit counter was given its own basic turn allowance. It was how many movement points it had. But why do we call it basic turn allowance? Why not call it movement points or something? And the answer was that in the original game, if you were commanding an army, you had, I believe the magic number was 30 movement points in your basic turn allowance, and you got to spread them out however you wanted over the units in your army. And you could give one unit 30 movement points, which would get it all the way across the board. Or you could give various units smaller numbers of movement points. It's noteworthy that the army in Tactics and Tactics 2, the two armies are about the same size. However, Tactics 2, the units in the field put together can go through about 200 movement points a turn. In Tactics, they only had 30 movement points total, and therefore motion tended to be a bit slow because you could only get the army to do so much at a time. And this somewhat resembles the fact, especially once the two armies are deployed in the field facing each other, that you only have so many resources and a mass offensive across the whole front line. You don't have the command and other resources to do that, probably. Okay, so that's various variations of command and control. Let us, however, move in the other direction. And the other direction are written orders. And the notion of written orders is if we are going to have command and control, one choice is to say, let's see how complicated, how close to reality we can make things. Now, the problem with written order rules is that someone has to carry out the written orders. And so this is fine if you have two players who want to experience the simulation and the look and feel of using written orders. Under competitive circumstances, the use of written orders would get much more complicated. There are miniatures groups that use written orders. It is usually the case that in miniatures tournaments using written orders, there will be one or more extremely unpleasant disagreements where player A has written orders, someone is interpreting them, and player A eventually concludes that the contest has been rigged and the orders are being misinterpreted quite deliberately. Once upon a time, I would see little references in Wargames Digest, and apparently the name-calling marched from simple name-calling to litigation. The people thought their good name was being damaged. Nonetheless, you can do written orders. But once you have done written orders, you now have to face all of the implicit complications. The simplest written orders we at least saw discussed back in 1914. That is, you have a grid and you have a map with drawings on it, and the drawings show the squares. And here someplace is a German unit, and so there is an arrow and there is a mark like that showing that the unit turns, and there is the next arrow, and that is how the oh, maybe there should be yet another arrow. That is how things are going to be carried out, one step at a time. And if the other side is doing the same thing, starting here, there is the first arrow, and there is the second arrow, which matches this turn. And now the third movement point tries this, the third movement point tries this, and we now have a meeting engagement. And it may be both sides try to move into the same square at the same time. That's one sort of meeting engagement. And it could also be the units start here and try to switch places, and that's a slightly different meeting engagement, and you need rules to resolve how this is done. And it may be you also have the ability, if you're drawing arrows, to mark the arrow so that the instruction is if the enemy is trying to enter the square at the same time, we will not try to do so. And so you stop a point short and you have some meeting engagement. Well, in any event, that's very simple written orders. It is written orders roughly at the level where there'd be a question on how you would input things, but you could write, it would appear, computer software that could actually implement the simultaneous movement issues and also implement all of the movement steps. The other extreme, though, is written order: cross West Ford, advance on the Blue House, set up defensive lines to the north and west. Well, that's sort of well defined, except, of course, where is this line supposed to be? How far out from Blue House? And it's sort of reasonable what might have been meant, but you can certainly get into arguments. Nonetheless, the Gamers: A Civil War series tries to implement written orders, except they put in all of the complications that existed in period with written orders. The most notable complication is you can order someone to do something, but A, your order may be incomprehensible. B, it may be comprehensible, but the man on the ground thinks that it's impossible or circumstances have changed. C, there may be other things going on. And so you send written orders out. Oh yes, they have to be read and understood first, which is more challenging if the enemy is charging the position at the time. And therefore, you have to evaluate, well, to what extent will the commander on the ground do as he's told, and to what extent will he exercise his own initiative. And so there's a lot of complication as to whether if you send orders out and how emphatic you make them, and whether they're written orders or verbal orders. There's a bunch of complications and some die rolls and tables that will determine whether your orders have any effect on your own units. So there's a lot of complication there of different sorts, and that complication arises for the simple reason that you're dealing with human beings. And your orders may be delayed because whoever gets them has to figure them out, or they may be distorted, meaning they're not understood correctly and don't do anything. And then, of course, since you're saying these players, extra characters on the ground may not do what they're told, you have a rule for initiative. And the point of the rule for initiative is that if I am the commander on the ground and I notice the enemy is marching by my position presenting an exposed flank, I may very well decide this is definitely the time to start shooting at them and then charge. even though that's not in my instructions. So I get to roll to see if I use initiative. Now, the commander who does not wants me to do as I'm told as opposed to what I think I should do may then send orders that attempt to suppress initiative. The problem is if the upstairs is effective at suppressing initiative, it may tend to stay suppressed. And the person on the ground will ignore wonderful opportunities because they're afraid of getting nipped at. Okay. A more complicated version of this is the gamers again, and they have a tactical series, and the tactical series represents World War II. And it represents World War II where, roughly speaking, each side has something like a regiment in total. Now, saying you have a regiment in total does not mean you have one unit counter. And the question is then, well, what is an appropriate number of unit counters? Well, it depends what fine-graining you want. The simplest example, the simplest explanation of the gamer's tactical combat series, and it really is tactical combat you're talking about, is that the tactical combat series is Panzerblitz, it's platoons, it's units of about the same size, except all of the details are filled in great detail, and there's things you have to do because the game runs multiple days. And it's sort of Panzerblitz writ large. So you have a large numbers of units representing platoons. The platoons are grouped into companies and then battalions. And for the most part, in order to get these units to do anything, you have to give them written orders. So you give these units written orders, and the written orders are mostly map-based. And so the written orders will show a group A, for example, and a group B, and a group C. And someplace here must be a list of who A, B, and C are. And A is to advance here and stop, and B is to advance here and to do nothing until C is reached here, and then B and C, having reached phase line Tuna, are now supposed to advance jointly on objective Flounder. And this gets fairly complicated. In order to control things, there are a bunch of pages showing examples of written orders so players have some idea of what the designers had in mind. There are restrictions on what is supposed to can be done. There are restrictions on things you must have, like if the attack fails, where do you fall back to? Things that the order must specify, which anyone in period would have done automatically. And then, of course, you have to get all of this into effect. And the answer is, the bigger the operation, the more different units that are involved, the more accumulated passing of orders and moving of supplies effort is needed, and this turns into some computed number of turns to execute. However, it's a nominal number of turns in that if the units are all sitting in reserves, it's fairly easy to get them up and going. If units are being attacked, they pile up turns more slowly. If the unit is already involved in an attack, it's very slow indeed. And so for a large operation, which can involve various things, you may need tens of turns before the attack actually goes in. Now, you can avoid this to an extent by breaking down the big attack into smaller attacks, which are each separate, but there's die rolling to see if things happen or not. There are coordination issues. And the net result is you have a set of written orders that arrange various things. You also have, I said it was Panzerblitz writ large, you have other complications. For example, suppose someone has decided we should shell the pretty town, fire artillery shells at the pretty town here and blow it up. Well, the way this is actually done, with ranged fire and directed fire is that you drop artillery shells into roughly the right area, and someone gives you corrections, and after a certain number of corrections, you are actually hitting the target as opposed to something that's one side or the other. This has improved with time under modern conditions, but in period, even with a good unit, you had to spend a bit of time getting the artillery pointed the right way, and this is all done on board where you are firing corrections until you reach the target. And you sort of have to realize that this is actually in detail in the rules. So what we are saying is we started with the fairly straightforward Panzerblitz rules, and we are putting more and more detail into the rules, and we are putting in more and more things that have to be taken into account. An interesting piece on this, you remember I said that Panzerblitz used design by effect for ammunition consumption. That is, they said over the length of any of these scenarios, units are unlikely to run out of ammunition, so we don't have to think about it. And that's not a perfect approximation. If you simply have a group of men marching across a field and engaging the enemy by fire, there will be a few people who only take a few shots or none, and there will be other people who will be happy to burn through all of the ammunition they can possibly carry right at the start of the battle, and then they're out of ammunition. So there are a range of possibilities, and what is done in Panzerblitz is say, we'll just hide this in the effect. What is done in the tactical game series is to say that if you do certain things with artillery, you are expending what are called units of fire. And you have to keep track of the units of fire for each of the small or large artillery units. Now, you don't have to keep track of moving the artillery shells around. That's being done invisibly because there are all of these trucks that are not represented with counters on the battlefield, and all of the trucks are hauling here and there, getting ammunition to the right place. But you're going through units of fire, and you have to realize that if you burn through most of your ammunition in one afternoon, come tomorrow morning at 3 a.m. when the enemy attacks, you may be a bit shorter of ammunition than you would like. And so you have the realistic issues. Short-term ammunition supply is not a problem, but long-term you have to think about what you're doing, and gee, it's another set of rules dealing with a particular set of issues. So we have all of these bits and pieces which I describe in more detail, saying we have operations sheets to give orders. Well, you have the units you're giving orders to, and you group them into battle groups, whatever. And the battle, you then give one order to each battle group, not separate orders to each unit. The orders can be somewhat general, advance along this axis and that axis until you get where you're going. If you are doing complicated night operations, you may want to specify exact routes. And this just keeps going on, and we now have a very large, complicated game with very detailed command and control rules. The virtue of the detailed command and control rules is that if you play under them, if you're willing to play under them, they give you a realistic experience, in a certain sense, of some aspects of what it was like to be engaged in a major battle in World War II, where you were the regiment commander. It's not perfect, and it's really designed for people who want to experience the simulation as opposed to people who want to determine who is the better commander. So that is the sort of thing you can do with command and control. What we will do next time is to push on to other rules such as combined arms or combat resolution or turn sequence. There are lots of other sorts of rules that you can elaborate. I should mention, since I have shipped out the latest draft of the book, if you go to the back, you will find, yes, it's still the Fall of Manchukuo rules back there, but they are now in one font, and I have inserted comments in a different font explaining what those rules do and mean, so you understand, well, why do I need all of these sentences in the rules? And the answer is you need all of those sentences so that players can figure out how to play the game, preferably the game you designed. So I guess we are done until next time.